So the title of my lecture is Globalization and the Transformation of the International State System. And it raises issues that I have previously not directly addressed because both the observation of what is going on in the world and the consequences from my previous theories sort of guide me to this particular subject. And I'll speak for about 45 minutes, and I ask for your patience. So in a globally integrated capitalist economy, borders between states are supposed to become economically irrelevant. Globalization is the ultimate form of liberalization. It shields free markets instituted on a global scale from state intervention, because state intervention can only be national state intervention. That's the only states that exist. In particular, state intervention of a redistributive kind. Rather than markets located in states, under globalization, states become located in markets. This has momentous consequences for the nature of statehood, both domestically and internationally. States located in markets lose the capacity to protect their economies and societies from economic competition. In fact, their role in their national economy, if one is left for them at all, is to deregulate that economy in order to make it more competitive internally first, and as a consequence, externally as well. As a result, old conflicts between capitalism and democracy re-emerge. Domestically, this is accompanied by a deep transformation of democratic political institutions, which in turn elicits powerful counter-movements opposing the neoliberal internationalization of national political economies and the economic neutralization of the nation-state. Internationally, globalization has now reached a point where it finally exceeds the capacity of capitalism's sitting hegemon, the United States, to control its periphery, and has vastly increased the costs of hegemony compared to its benefits. As costs and benefits are asymmetrically distributed in the political economy of the United States, where industrial sectors and industrial regions bear the costs and the financial sector appropriates the benefits, domestic popular resistance, against American global leadership has been growing for some time. Moreover, global capitalism's expansion has brought China into the game, a strange hybrid of free market capitalism and statist nationalism, and a country that is far too big for the United States to absorb it into an American-dominated world order. This poses the question of whether the United States and China will be able in future to agree on something like a co-directorate of the capitalist world economy. The alternative may be a global battle for dominance, like in the first half of the 20th century between Anglo-American liberalism, German fascism, and Japanese imperialist nationalism. In the following, I will discuss selected aspects of the relationship between capitalist globalization and national statehood, treating current domestic and international developments as two sides of the same coin, as different manifestations of a single multifaceted process of economic and political transformation of the modern state system. I begin with the conversion in Western democracies of their post-war class-based politics into a new identitarian politics, which has generated new and more complex lines of domestic political cleavage. Moreover, globalization increases regional disparities. This is a subject with which I have recently been fascinated. Increases regional disparities, encouraging old and new separatisms, especially in large and centralized, typically multinational states. Growing claims for more autonomy within or, if necessary, outside of existing national states and international organizations, unless suppressed by authoritarian rule, are part of a new politics of political scale, as I call it, where small size and the high social homogeneity often related to it may seem attractive, not just for cultural, but also for economic reasons. Finally, I suggest that centrifugal tendencies within and between states may raise the possibility or the demand for a post-imperialist, nation-centered international order that respects the sovereignty of smaller countries and secures peace and cooperation through what is called in the European integration debate a variable geometry of flexible alliances among equals. Also, a word from European integration research, integration à la carte, an international order that works sort of on the ground through relations between independent states. So let me begin by saying something on the decline of the standard model of a democratic nation state. The progress of globalization has put an end to the post-war reconciliation between capitalism and democracy. For a short period of about 3 decades, capitalism and democracy coexisted more or less peacefully within a new standard, what I call a new standard model of a democratic nation state, instituted by the United States in its sphere of influence after 1945, along the lines of its own New Deal social settlement. Democratic capitalism was state-administered capitalism, different from both liberal and fascist capitalism, as well as from Stalinist communism, another form of organization of industrial societies. It provided for reasonably free elections, governments dependent on parliamentary majorities, broad-based political parties of the center-left and center-right, a pluralistic mass media, and importantly, strong trade unions with the right to strike, freely negotiating collective agreements, regulating wages and working conditions, and only moderate repression of opposition, except, of course, where it came too close to Soviet communist anti-capitalism. It's important in this section to remember that trade unions and collective bargaining were an essential part of this post-war model. It was not just elections. It was much more than that. Now, standard model democracy rested on a mixed economy with a strong public sector. Political intervention corrected the outcome of free markets and of the free deployment of capitalist property rights. It functioned as an engine of social and economic progress by securing popular support for capitalism through redistributive, egalitarian intervention in market outcomes. This was the condition for what I call the renewal of the capitalist hunting license after 1945. The egalitarian basis of mass democracy produced slowly but steadily rising wages and wage shares, halfway secure employment, indeed full employment as a social and political right, comprehensive social insurance, continually adjusted to newly arising social needs and economic possibilities for what was then called a decommodification of social life, ushering in an age of compression, quote unquote, of incomes, wealth, living standards, and life chances. That world actually existed, but only for a limited period. Standard model democracy, as established in an international family of national states, that's important. It needed an environment as well as an inside. Standard model democracy helped suppress ethnic divisions within national citizenries. It did so by imposing on them an institutionalized class politics between capital and labor, dividing societies ideally in no more than two camps, one around labor and the other around capital. Distributional conflicts over the returns from politically managed economic growth dominated national politics for about 3 decades, as long as internationally coordinated Keynesianism created space for nationally specific versions of class compromise and an expansion of social citizenship outside of and containing market relations. This arrangement began to fall apart in the 1970s after the global wave of labor militancy in the preceding decade, which resulted in worldwide inflation and a profit squeeze motivating capital flight into a largely ungoverned international economy. Moreover, national governments unable to contain inflation and deliver on their post-war commitment to politically guaranteed full employment placed their hopes on economic internationalization as the most promising remaining source of economic growth, and also as a means of disciplining workers and trade union demands they could no longer fulfill, disciplining by competition. By the 1990s at the latest, centrist political parties of both left and right throughout the Western world, and I'm talking about the countries of the center of the capitalist system, political parties of both the left and right had adopted the Washington Consensus, which expected a revitalization of capitalism from its liberalization, achieved by its integration into an open global economy. Neoliberalism, as the new doctrine came to be called, incidentally, that was not a new term. It was a term that went back to the 1920s, to the theories by Hayek and Mises and others who wanted to reconstitute the liberalism of the era before 1914 with free trade, the global gold standard, and so on. They were afraid of the new nation states that arose from the Paris settlements as a result of the end of the war and the breaking up of the empires. So it's not a new term. Neoliberalism, as the new doctrine came to be called, and the globalization of the capitalist political economy that underlies that neoliberalism fundamentally changed the politics of capitalist democracies away from the post-war standard model. Pressures for restructuring and more flexibility in labor markets undermined trade unions and collective bargaining as engines of egalitarian redistribution. Programmatic differences between the centrist parties of liberal conservative and social conservative and social democratic coloration vanished. The differences between them vanished in favor of an internationalist pensée unique. This meant embracing more or less passionately politically unmanaged international markets as a preordained condition to which national politics and individual lives had to adapt or else suffer the consequences. In the course of this post-war politics, post-war politics lost attraction. Not only did trade unions decline, and with it the incidence of strikes and the coverage of workers by collective bargaining, but voter turnout and the membership of centrist political parties shrunk as well. As the center-left in particular moved into the third way, telling its constituents to cherish globalization as an opportunity to get rich by acquiring new skills and learn to live with markets and competition, including the uncertainty and inequality that they inevitably bring, new ways of appealing to voters had to be found. Having given up on class collectivism in favor of privatization, not just of the public sector, but also of personal life, favoring, in other words, private consumption over public provision, center-left progressivism compensated for its desertion of economic equality by emphasizing categoric equality, turning from a class perspective to an identitarian perspective of collective interests and of a good society. What used to be social democracy, having lost its base in a state-managed national economy, tried to find new ideological and political ground in a politics of middle-class libertarianism, now fighting traditionalism instead of capitalism, and leaving its previous clientele without a political voice. The replacement of class politics with the politics of identity weakens social cohesion at national level, which in turn gives rise to call for national unity as an opposing movement. Identity politics makes for complex patterns of political cleavage that tend to be inaccessible to the sort of split-in-the-middle negotiated compromise that under class politics kept social peace. So take the usual libertarian issues. There can be no compromise. You either have separate laws for transgender people or you don't. There's nothing in between. Politics organized around social identities are at risk of fragmenting. Since, unlike class interests, the articulation and political address of identitarian interests may reinforce rather than bridge social divisions. Conflict resolution via liberal dispensations of constitutional and human rights, or by appealing to tolerance and pointing to the attractions of diversity, will not necessarily suffice to settle cultural conflicts. Instead, it may result in the emergence of a society of minorities. In fact, as we now know, discontent with the withdrawal of public policy from economic protection and with the playing down of collective national material interests in favor of group identitarian collective interests may pave the way for a return of nationalist sentiments in at least two ways. First, especially as the case of the United States shows, social groups that do not figure among the newly politically favored minorities may begin to demand special group interests for themselves also, on the model of recognized minorities, even though they may still be in a numerical majority. But if they are being told all the time that in 20 years you will only be a minority in your country and you should be happy about it, then they may not be so happy after all. And second, those that still depend on an active interventionist state, or believe that they do, may insist that rights be underwritten by obligations, especially but not just for the better off. As the only place where social obligations can be created and enforced is still the democratic nation state, calls for redistributive solidarity often come with appeals to national identity. It is above all at this point that globalist internationalism is confronted with a growing nationalist populism. I skip a part on immigration and I move on to the theme that I think will be important in future as a subject of political theory and political research, a new regionalism. As the redistributive capacity of states under globalization is diminished, inequality increases not just between income groups or classes, but also between regions. With the declining significance of the institutionalized class conflict, disparities between territorial sub-societies rise to political prominence. I spare you the statistics, but it is clear that in almost all countries, the last 20 years, the years of neoliberalism, make for a rising disparity between the leading and the lagging regions of a political economy. That's an almost universal phenomenon. Following the demise of the standard model, discontent over regional inequality is easier to organize than class conflict, among other things by reawakening memories of historical, often ethnic conflicts over the formation and centralization of modern nation states. And in this sense, regionalism is also an expression of the new identitarianism. Yeah? They take Spain with Catalonia or the United Kingdom with Scotland. There's an old grievance in Scotland because 500 years ago the Scots were defeated by the English, and then the two were, but they still feel strongly about it. Unlike class politics, neo-regionalism fosters centrifugal tendencies in nation-state politics. That's an important difference to class politics. And it makes the preservation of national unity difficult. There are various ways in which the shift from markets embedded in states to states embedded in markets may lead to national disintegration. For example, as national economies become integrated in a global economy, being part of a large national market is no longer required for economic prosperity, given that the same and even greater economic opportunities and market access are offered by global markets. Yeah? If the motivation to stay into a national economy is to have a large market, then that disappears the moment that you have open global markets. This makes the expression of older subnational identities and of desires for political autonomy related to them less economically costly. Also, in countries where economic sectors cluster regionally, or for example, the Catalonian separatists want to be part of the European Union. That makes perfectly sense because they need a market. If they are no longer bound by the Spanish market, there's a larger market. And then there could even be an even larger market. Also in countries where economic sectors cluster regionally, as they often do, regions that are the home of internationally competitive sectors of a national economy may resent being taxed by the national state for the cross-subsidization of less well-endowed regions, especially if they themselves face strong international competition. If central governments nevertheless insist on regional redistribution from winners to losers, Scottish oil to this is likely to encourage secessionism. An example is, again, Catalonia. If, on the other hand, national governments have to give in to their competitive regions cum sectors for political reasons, but also in order not to damage their global competitiveness, weaker regional political economies may either turn nationalist, calling for a more centralized nation state, or, to the contrary, give up hopes for national solidarity and opt for trying their luck on their own. A special case of regional disparities is the widening gap almost everywhere in capitalist democracies between large global cities and their surrounding countryside. Here, the place of territorial separatism is taken by an urban culture of cosmopolitan anti-nationalism, reflecting the similarities across countries in economic conditions and social ways of life in cities like Berlin, London, Paris, New York, also others. This may make the cleavage between citizens and hinterlands appear as mainly a cultural one. Underlying it, however, is often an aversion of cities, now the growth poles of national economies, against being taxed for the rest of their countries, where they happen to be located, and an aversion that hinterland citizens tend to consider in violation of national solidarity. Now, there's very interesting conflicts in almost all countries, for example, on taxation, tax cuts for the new growing urban industries. There's also the fact that post-industrial growth does not require heavy capital investment, but people and the synergies between people in the same space. So it's very easy for a young person to move from let's say, a small town in England, Durham, to London. That's something being done in a very short time. And then it's sort of the growth potential of London increases in things like design, microelectronics, and so on. You don't need much capital investment. You need people. Yeah. Surprisingly, globalization, as it crosses a certain threshold, seems to militate not toward imperial inclusion, supranational integration, and governmental centralization. Instead, it appears to generate pressures for units of governance becoming smaller or less centralized, with greater local economy in a less tight and less hierarchically controlled national or international order. And that call for local sovereignty, I think, is also observable all over the place, where globalization via capitalist expansion does not promote outright separatism, as it did in the former Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, remember it sort of split up in two countries, and the former Soviet Union. It seems to generate powerful demands for political decentralization or devolution, one of the main issues in British and in French politics. Examples are Spain, Belgium. Belgium is only kept together by the national debt because the two parts of Belgium cannot agree how to subdivide the debt between them, and they are indebted over the years. Spain, Belgium, Canada, Italy, the United Kingdom, and even to an extent Germany. I can say something on Germany maybe later. Often decentralization seems to be the only democratic way of keeping large states united. So a paradoxical relationship. The price of unity after the end of the standard model being a surrender of power and competences to smaller, more cohesive and socially homogeneous lower level units of political organization. This observation is applicable also to the European Union, which suffers from growing tensions between subnational and national nationalism, as well as between national and supranational nationalism. The states want to sort of break out of, want no longer to be governed by Brussels, and segments of the nation states do not no longer to be governed by their national capitals. Reflecting the decline of the standard model of democracy at the nation-state level on the one hand, and the impossibility of instituting at the supranational level a standard democracy. The latter, of course, is due to the refusal of European Union member states to abandon their national sovereignty, which they all seem to consider the more valuable, the more exposed they are to global markets, the opposite of what you would normally think. While Brexit is the most visible expression of a desire of nation states to, as they said, take back control, that was the slogan. National resistance against supranational government is strong also in Eastern Europe and increasingly in Southern Europe as well. The most obvious case being Italy's new so-called populist rebellion against the European Union's so-called Stability and Growth Pact, which for Italy is the opposite. It's the Instability and Decline Pact, dictated, of course, by the German and the French government. How strong the new centrifugal forces are in today's state system can also be seen from the fact that large countries that refuse to make concessions to them, perhaps because they want to hold on to the international power dividend of large size, seem increasingly to resort to a more authoritarian system of political rule. See the recent trend towards different forms of nationalist autocracy in large countries with regional inequality, with high regional inequality, like Russia, Turkey, the Philippines, presumably Brazil as well, certainly China, and in different ways, the United States. So I'm trying to explain these shifts to autocracy in a more grounded way. It's not just that these people are dumb, and there's something going on here which is much more important. In places like these, liberal democracy may no longer be enough to keep countries united, given the diminished redistributive capacity of central governments. The upshot may be that under conditions of a globally integrated economy, democracy may be most likely to survive in small political units, either in small sovereign nation states or in small autonomous cantons in large but decentralized sovereign nation states. What is at issue here seems to be a new politics of scale or of political architecture. Units of sovereign self-government may either be large or small. The smaller, the more numerous they are, everything else being equal. A political architecture of a few large units internalizes a broad range of governance functions in its national constituent units, simplifying the international relations between them. By comparison, a political architecture of many small units depends on an international order that compensates for the weaknesses that come with small political size while supporting the effective use of its strength. The apparently growing centrifugal tendencies in today's international state system seem to indicate that it may be better for a nation under globalization to be small and dependent on a functioning international order than to be large and relatively self-contained. An important comparison arises, of course, where small and large states exist next to each other, resulting, at least possibly, in a hierarchical or imperialistic international system, where small size may, in effect, come with diminished sovereignty. Now, I will say a few words on small states in world markets, and then I will turn to a few considerations on on the international system. It is worth noting that as the world became simultaneously more global and more capitalist, the number of sovereign states has grown, not declined. While in 1950 there were 84 states, 60 of them in the United States, in the United Nations, only 60. In 2017, there were 196 states, all but 3 United Nations members. Obviously, major forces behind this were decolonization, the end of empire, and later the breakup of the last European empire, the Soviet Union. Average state size declined, even as global population increased. In 2010, the median size of states was around 8.4 million people. I understand that Chile would then be a big rather than a small state, at least above this level. In other words, median means that 100 of these 200 states are smaller than 8.4 million. Importantly, there were no cases of voluntary mergers, not at all in the post-war history, apart from the United Arab Republic that soon broke apart. This was, imagine, Iraq, Egypt, and Syria. that didn't last long. And apart from Germany, which was a case, however, of belated reunification after the country's division in 1945. Even tiny Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia never thought of forming a united Baltic Republic, or whatever you could call it, after regaining their independence from the Soviet Union or Russia. Apparently, the cultural individualism observed in modern societies finds an expression also, an equivalent, in a sort of structural individualism at the level of collective political architecture. It is true that some of today's states are quasi-private hunting grounds of oligarchs or kleptocrats or warlords of all kinds, often kept in place against the will of their citizens by post-colonial or imperial powers. There are also more than enough failed states, often products of misconceived so-called humanitarian interventions, abandoned when turning out more difficult than expected. But even democratic states, like the Nordic ones, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, have never in modern times thought of merging, regardless of a dense web of freely negotiated cooperative relationships between them. Yeah. And that may actually be a model for international relations in the future. Why should it be attractive to be small and sovereign in an era of capitalist globalization? In the 1970s, Peter Katzenstein, in a seminal book with the title Small States and World Markets, showed that small countries, being necessarily more dependent economically on international trade, tended to interpret the conflictual class cooperation as institutionalized in what was then the standard model, interpreted more in the direction of cooperation than of conflict. The rationale was to protect citizens from global market risks by developing superior productive capacities that were to assure the country a leading position in specific sections of the global marketplace. Austria was an example that he studied, or Denmark, for example. Today, small state productivism seems to have its most promising expression in an industrial policy of what may be called sectoral specialization, pursued by governments together with national business and what is left of trade unions. Sectoral specialization uses the full capacities of a sovereign national state to build a rich social and physical infrastructure tailor-made for a small portfolio of selected economic sectors to enable these sectors to find, occupy, and defend profitable niches in the global economy, niches where high incomes can be earned for the national population as a whole. So concentrating on sector specialization, going it alone by focusing the national economy on a few high value-added sectors like logistics, Denmark, or the Netherlands, design, Denmark, business consulting, Sweden, finance, Switzerland, or precision engineering, also to a large extent Switzerland, requires a customized public policy from education to immigration, as well as a high level of social and political cohesion and technocratic entrepreneurialism, of a sort that large countries, which have many sectors to attend to simultaneously, are not likely to master. Now, finally, I turn to the question of the international order that is required for this. An international order accommodating more widely dispersed national autonomy will have to differ profoundly from the so-called rule-bound liberal order of the West that limited what states could do for themselves and their citizens, in particular with respect to trade and the management of their economies. The breakdown of that order may, after the experience of globalization, not seem much of a loss to many. Looked at with hindsight, it is obvious that the post-war international order was not at all, not for all states rule-governed, not for the United States in particular, which always reserved for itself a choice between unilateral, bilateral, and multilateral action, something I don't have to say in Chile, calling itself the indispensable nation, that's Obama rhetoric, implying presumably that other nations may be dispensable. In this respect, the liberal order was more of an imperial order, one in which the United Kingdom sought the role of first lieutenant, and France considered itself as something like the center of a sub-empire within a more encompassing West. In functional terms, the benefits of the liberal imperialist international order may well be overstated. A good example is the European Union, a political construction where rule-bound liberalism was and still is stronger than anywhere else. One reason why it has fallen in disrepute is that the only kind of international integration, quote unquote, it managed to enforce was a negative one, mandating member states to open their markets and refrain from protecting weak firms and weak sectors and their workers. Decade-long attempts to get member states to agree on effective measures against tax evasion remained fruitless, not just because intra-European tax havens were effectively defended by the member states in which they were located, Britain is a great example, but also because in the open markets of the liberal world order, there are enough tax havens outside of Europe. Piketty and his co-authors have shown this again and again, how this works. There is also, of course, the fact that the Union actively promoted the neoliberal transformation of its member states' political economies by failing to build a democratic polity at the supranational level, able, for example, to produce a common social policy. As to the global regime led by the United States, of which the European Union was part, it always included a periphery of kleptocratic states that were anything but liberal or democratic. Moreover, the liberal world order's hegemon, accounting for half the global spending on defense, 50% of military spending in the world is in the United States, managed to make other states in its ambit take part in their humanitarian interventions and erratic crusades for democracy all over the world. Mostly unsuccessful, they created chaos rather than order. What indications are there for the possibility of a post-liberal, less imperialistic, more decentralized international order? One may be the rise of China. Conceivably, China, in a departure from a long national tradition, may seek an empire of its own to confront the Western empire. But traditionally, the Chinese do not think in terms of empire. They think in terms of them being the middle kingdom in the center of the world, and they don't have to be. The Chinese have no single soldier anywhere outside their country, whereas the Americans have soldiers in 120 countries. the rise of China. But the decline of the United States and the attendant rise of American isolationism, that's what I see, what Trump means when he says America first, not the George Bush kind of America first. We are cleaning up everywhere. The decline of the United States may also allow for a global balance of power that leaves smaller states more autonomy, with the possibility for a variable geometry, as I said, of voluntary cooperation among them. Note that China, unlike the United States before Trump defeated Clinton, seems to have no intention to impose its mode of government on other countries. The US always, they always believe that they can deal with a country only if they democratize it or put in their buddies, their friends. The Trumpist America first may mean a project to restore American hegemony, but it may also indicate a will to give primacy to the domestic problems of the United States, repair the country, not the world. In fact, isolationism of this kind may be what Trump's voters want, following in a long nationalist, in the sense of anti-internationalist tradition in American populism. Last point, can a truly multipolar, pluralist, decentralized, nation-centered rather than imperial world order work? One without superpowers lording it over their respective collections of vassal states. Can it, in other words, provide for something like peace and prosperity? Regarding prosperity, I said something on the example of small countries specializing on their niche, on a niche in the world market. Not a strategy that will work, that will be guaranteed to work, but at least something where you can see that this thing can work, at least in some places. Regarding peace, small states depend on an international system that firmly enshrines and respects national sovereignty. While they are unlikely to attack other states, because they are small, they must be protected by strongly institutionalized international norms from being attacked. In addition to large states keeping each other in check, this requires that there are no large states with a sense of mission, democratic or otherwise. After the demise of the Soviet Union, and with the recently more inward-looking United States, this condition may be easier met than ever since the end of the Second World War. Protecting small countries' sovereignty may also require that so-called humanitarian interventions are entrusted, where they still take place, are entrusted only to alliances of small states under a strictly defined international mandate, to prevent them from being instrumentalized for imperial purposes. Obviously, also, the so-called war on terrorism would become a matter for the police rather than the military, which is appropriately should be. I conclude here by saying that those who know my work will be surprised that there's a small sense of optimism in this description, but I do think that one should at least try to understand where the openings for a positive solution rather than a continuation of the crisis are. And I have decided that if societies, territorially settled societies, want to develop their own strength by using the toolkit of nation-state sovereignty, and where they, as a result, become dependent on a different nation-centered, sovereignty-respecting international order, the potential opening that lies in the fact that in future, for the first time, we may have a co-directorate of the capitalist economy with two, rather than just one hegemon, might offer some sort of hope for a peaceful and prosperous development in the political economy of an integrated global world. Thank you very much for listening.
Bueno, le agradezco al profesor Streeck por su interesantísima conferencia, relevante para politólogos, sociólogos, historiadores, etc. Como siempre, la idea es dar paso a preguntas. Hay un micrófono. Ahí está el micrófono. Y ahí hay otro. Es mejor en general, tomamos 3 preguntas y ahí el profesor Streeck va respondiendo. Partimos aquí.
Okay. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I want to ask you more, or maybe challenge you, if I understood you correctly, on your assumption. So it seems that nation states can continue to play a role in this new order, because I doubt this for several reasons. First of all, I think that they have been quite complicit in all these developments. So you yourself, you talked about the third wave and the problem that social democratic parties have selling international capitalist prosperity to their constituencies. And you also said that the EU didn't want to build a common social policy. It was the member states that didn't want to produce a common social policy. So I think they've been quite implicit in bringing all these developments about. So I wonder, even if there was more nation-state autonomy in that respect, would it be any different? And I also wonder about their role, because you also mentioned the group rights, and very often nation-states themselves, they violate group rights, and then actually groups need courts, like for example, European Court of Human Rights, to judge against their nation-state that doesn't protect their rights. And also, it seems that they are not very territorially settled, as you also seem to assume, with all the separatist movements that are going on. And so I wonder to what extent a nation-state can actually exert the power that is needed for the counter-movement. Thank you.
Buenos días. En su análisis, usted no mencionó un tipo de procesos cuya importancia es creciente. Los especialistas señalan que hemos entrado en un periodo de cambios fundamentales desde el punto de vista de la crisis ambiental. Ahora, esta crisis ambiental no solamente tiene estos aspectos que se refieren al ambiente, sino que está teniendo ya efectos económicos y políticos importantes. Los especialistas señalan que los efectos más difíciles lo van a sufrir las economías pequeñas, lo van a sufrir las economías del antiguo llamado tercer mundo. Y esto va a crear un problema también internacional, puesto que hay un problema de responsabilidad, ya que son las grandes naciones las que en mayor medida están produciendo la mayor contaminación y desequilibrio ambiental. Ahora, esto probablemente va a la vez a alterar el mercado mundial, el mercado de alimentos, grandes sequías que se están produciendo, etcétera, etcétera. Entonces, hay ahí un factor de indeterminación, como usted diría, mayor aún, que va a ser difícil que las tendencias que usted señala puedan realizarse de esa manera, en cierto sentido, optimista que usted presenta.
Allá, ¿no? ¿No? Aquí es la tercera pregunta y después respuesta y volvemos a...
Once again, thank you for the presentation. But my question is about the factor of tax havens and the flow of capital due to taxation. My question is exactly how are we gonna deal with Monaco or with the Cayman Islands, which we're gonna block it economically, or we're gonna to create a new worldwide, non-localized economic police? Bueno, en castellano. Respecto al factor de los paraísos fiscales y la huida de los capitales debido a los impuestos, ¿cómo exactamente tendríamos que lidiar con los países como por ejemplo Mónaco o las Islas Caimán? ¿Deberíamos bloquearlos económicamente para impedir que lleguen los ingresos, o deberíamos crear un nuevo brazo de economía mundial sin localizar, deslocalizada?
No, now it's working. Now it's working. I begin with a third question. It is important to keep in mind that the present world order was and is clearly unable to deal with the problem of tax havens. So if the next world order that I described is also unable, we at least do not have a deterioration of the situation. It will be the same. Now, I do, however, think that part of the program of a revitalization of a nation state that fends for itself, not bound by international rules, or not bound by the present system of international rules, could become a place where the unlimited mobility of capital could be constrained and limited. For example, in the European Union, it is now impossible, due to European Union competition law, to maintain systems of national savings banks that are guaranteed by the national government and therefore are able to give out credit at a lower interest rate than the normal banks, the private banks. And Brussels becomes a tool for the big private banks, you can say the international financial system, to suppress such national, local, regional systems of finance. And if we lift the international free trade agreements and modify them, then that could become possible again. Yeah? I'm not saying that, and going to the second question, I'm not saying that this thing will solve all the questions. Quite to the contrary. But what it will perhaps stimulate is a perception that unless we do it, it will not be done. Today, people are sort of relying on the Paris agreements and on the United States and China to sort of implement environmental protection, of course, where everybody knows. You have these conferences where they all agree on 1.5 degrees by 2050, and everybody knows that 1.5 degrees by 2050 is impossible. Yeah? It's just for declaration purposes. Our German environmental minister came back from Paris crying in front of the television cameras out of sheer happiness that she said we were able to lower the level of the agreement from 2 degrees to 1.5 degrees. 2 degrees is as unrealistic as one, but these politicians live in a world in which in which their dreams replace reality, or their press declarations. And the whole idea is that small states are much better able to hold their politicians to account because they can be more lively democracies. Does that solve all the problems? No, not at all. But that fundamental change that is going on must be managed in some way. And our present international system certainly is unable to do that. So there's time to try something new. Can nation states do this? The first question. Yeah, if you look at nation states that are models for responsible international behavior, like the small Scandinavian states, in many ways also now Switzerland, you can, yes, there seems to be a possibility for this. The closer governments are to an enlightened public opinion, the more they can be influenced. Can you influence the American government? No, forget it. Yeah, forget it. Whereas in America, we now have a debate on the states of the United States as they call it, laboratories of democracy. And governors want more autonomy to address the specific problems that their voters have. In other words, we're talking about the new politics. The old politics, in my view, is over. The standard model cannot be reconstructed. And as far as group rights and international courts are concerned, that is nice for seminars in a law school. In reality, the attempt to impose a certain politics through international courts on national governments may work for a short time, and then it produces a backlash. Yeah, then it produces a backlash. Hungary is a dramatic example of this. So is Poland. The Hungarians have a party in government that has, probably in your view and partly in my view as well, a sort of anachronistic view of what Hungary should be like. That includes that you have many children so that you don't need many immigrants, right? The German government is trying to tell them that this is a morally unacceptable position. Yeah, do you think that these people will say, Angela tells us, Saint Angela tells us that we should have not more children, but more immigrants? No, you will get a government that becomes ever more testy. And if you try to take them to the European Court, then they will violate they will not follow what the court tells them. Take Italy. Italy is now under an injunction to lower its public debt. What does the new government do? They stock up their public debt. And now they see it through with Brussels. Do you think Brussels can regulate the fiscal policies of Rome? Impossible. Yeah? That's why I think a restoration of national responsibility for the fate of that community that constitutes itself as a nation organized in a nation state. And the sense that it depends on us. We have to decide. Nobody else can decide for us. Then you have to accept diversity. The internationalists tell us, celebrate diversity. Yeah? But when it comes to diversity, especially in this kind of thing, they become extremely hostile. They want everybody to be the way they are. Then they have enough diversity.
Aquí. Ahí después Eduardo y después hay una pregunta.
Thank you, Professor Streeck, for this inspiring talk. I found very interesting your shift of your attention towards sub-regional politics. I find an interesting development. And I have two remarks on that, that maybe are more pessimistic than your optimism. So the first one is, if I understood you well, you basically are saying that at the level of sub-regional or sub-national regions, we could be able to reconcile democracy and capitalism once again. So what we were able to do at the national level, now we will be able to do at kind of smaller territorial level. So my question there is, wouldn't be that buying time once again if we take seriously that actually capitalism continue being the problem? And the second question, if we kind of exit from Europe, if we don't look at Europe, if we look at other regions, for instance, Asia, we already have like 2-3 decades of fragmentation of the production. We have what the phenomenon that you already talked about, the specialization, sectoral specialization. And we don't see, I think, the type of regional politics and demands for regional emancipation that you are talking about. On the contrary, it seems like Asian states actually are turning more authoritarian, more nationalistic, or at least using more often the repressive tools of state building. You know? So in that regard, my feeling is that your optimism is too much attached to the European cases. Thank you.
Eduardo.
Sí, pregunto en español para que me comprenda todo el mundo. la pregunta es esta, ¿hasta qué punto el optimismo moderado, ¿no es cierto?, que usted formula, no podría estar interferido o en todo caso, ¿de qué manera habría que ponerlo en relación con fenómenos que ya no son netamente económicos, a pesar de que están relacionados íntimamente con los fenómenos económicos? Y me refiero, por ejemplo, a esto, ¿no? A la dimensión de la cultura, en el sentido de que a partir más o menos de los años 60, uno diría, bueno, el mundo, se expande por el mundo una suerte de cultura global en la cual todos estamos impregnados, y esto no se trata de decir que algo sea bueno o malo, pero que es una cultura profundamente individualista, profundamente libertaria en el sentido norteamericano de la palabra. De hecho, es la cultura norteamericana la que se expande por el mundo. Y que no solamente se expande a través de la tecnología, sino que también impregna, podríamos decir, el mismo desarrollo tecnológico, ¿no? El ejemplo quizás más evidente de esto es el smartphone o el iPhone, la cultura del I, la cultura del yo. Entonces, bueno, cultura y desarrollo tecnológico, y por otra parte, esta recomposición de los... Bueno, por otra parte también la crisis de una crisis, yo diría que no es solamente económica, sino que es una crisis de lo que podríamos llamar el dispositivo moderno de producción y legitimación de la verdad, ¿no? Y de las élites que producen y ponen en circulación verdades públicas. Y por último, en el sentido, digamos, de la recomposición de los estados nacionales, ¿cómo es posible que eso funcione sin energías culturales, sin energías sociales, que de alguna manera son energías atávicas que son los viejos nacionalismos, y por lo tanto, digamos, hasta qué punto no se trata, ¿no es cierto?, de una homogeneización cultural, étnica, y por lo tanto violentamente excluyente. Eso.
La última pregunta de la tanda.
Thanks. First of all, I found really fascinating your perspective, your analysis. I'm here. In as much as it goes against kind of the mainstream view according to which we should dilute sovereignty into, broader supranational organizations, or such as the European Union, or even at the global level, global governance and so forth. Whereas you seem to emphasize the importance and the stability that could bring into the international system a renewed sovereignty, national sovereignty, to a smaller scale. I have two observations or critiques. The first one is that I'm wondering, and this goes along the comment of Stefano, I'm wondering whether this is a very Eurocentric view, in the sense that, we do I'm wondering whether scale is the real issue. Small states. We do have small states in Western Africa, for instance, and they're not able to govern not even their capital cities. We do have small authoritarian states in Southeast Asia and so on and so forth. And I guess that this has to do with state capacities, with the cohesion and homogeneity of national communities. So I'm not that persuaded that scale is the variable. And besides, I wonder whether a much more fragmented international system would be peaceful, or rather more prone to conflict. And in that case, all this breaking up of small or of nation states into smaller states, or even like supranational regions or partially supranational regions such as the EU into smaller national communities, would be like dangerous, and what kind of actor would would enforce peace. I mean, unless, you know, unless supranational, like hegemons, huge hegemons such as China and the United States would do it. And in this sense, the liberal order, the embedded liberalism, had relied a lot, at least on the paper, on international organizations. Yeah, you're right, but I mean, you don't mention, not for a second, international organizations, which is quite interesting. And last point is, what's your take on the European Union? Because I'm not sure I got. I mean, are you kind of wishing for or hoping for like a disgregation of the European Union? Is it the best scenario? Thanks.
Again, I begin at the end, and the European Union is an attempt to build something like a European superstate that takes the place of the member states. They don't say that. Yeah, they try to do it sort of through the back door. This thing has completely failed. Yeah, it is in a deep crisis, and you can try to drag on with this pressure for a while, and what you will get is chaos, like we had in Greece, and in many ways already still have, and in the European immigration policy, relationship to the East, relationship to Italy, the very ambiguous relationship between Germany and France. All sort of related to this impossible project of turning European states into a superstate. Yeah? So I have been in empirical work and in theoretical work for at least 2 decades trying to explain that to my colleagues and to the European public and so on, so Germany in particular. And I think slowly, people are beginning to realize that this is an unrealistic project. It's not even desirable, because trying to think of Bulgaria and Denmark being governed by the same government, completely ridiculous. Completely ridiculous. Two completely different worlds, completely different problems. Yeah. So does this mean that I advocate a return, as some strange person a while ago claimed I do, a return to the European land wars of the 19th century? Yeah? The idea that France tries to get back the left bank of the Rhine forever. That's completely stupid rhetoric. Yeah? In Europe, we can still have a joint air traffic control system, a joint railway system, which we're having, what I call cooperative relations between sovereign states. And Europe will be rich in these cooperative arrangements because we're so close together. And there's no, if you want to travel from Cologne to Paris, which you now do in 4 hours, with the French fast train, and soon also with the German fast train, as soon as the French learn that the German train is technologically up to the task of driving on French rails. But up to now, they pretend that this is not the case, right? So then you can go in 4 hours from Paris to fantastic, yeah? Who wants to give this up? Yeah? But the idea of an integrated European army, with the French wielding their nuclear power and the Germans furnishing the ground troops, that is something that is part of this dream of an integrated European system. And that is completely out of the question. Yeah. And it is not useful, not even for world, not for world peace. And that comes the other question about the post-colonial situation. I have learned in these debates to start from what we have, not from what we should have, and from there to explore what we can have. Yeah? Western Africa is penetrated by American and French special forces, keeping these kleptocratic governments in power. Yeah? Building a European army would, under present circumstances, only mean that you could mobilize military from Germany, wherever, to help this effort, which is called maintaining order in Western Africa, or defending or defeating terrorism in Western Africa, or Islamistic movements. Yeah? But what it basically is, it is sort of keeping in place countries that we, or the French, or the Americans, will not allow to have their own democratic revolutions. Yes? Under the present order, they will not be allowed to this. Is it guaranteed that under a different order they will actually do this? No. But I believe in this, in the sovereignty of people. So people should decide their own fate, and it should not be dictated from Paris or Berlin or Brussels, nor from the United States. Give them a chance. Yeah? We have had that chance in the 19th century. Why shouldn't we give that chance to others as well? Are they less intelligent than we are? For God's sake, no. Yeah? So that's my point on this. It gets a little bit passionate, but I think we should not govern others. In fact, our charge is to give them a chance. And that also applies to the small state problem. But I mean, one of the problems that you can see in places like Asia or the Middle East, Africa, is that the colonial powers sort of at a desk, at the table in London, sort of drew borders there that are completely ridiculous, that have nothing to do with the ethnic composition of these people. As a result, you have internecine warfare within these countries up to the present day. Yeah? Should one not think that states should have some sort of reason to fill their citizens with the same sense of patriotic responsibility for themselves, yeah, rather than separated by different cultures and decades and hundreds of years of mutual hate? That cannot work. Yeah. So the variable, what I use, the concept of the variable geometry of a cooperative, more flexible order. That's at least something that would be a vision for Europe. Yeah? Not a new land war between Germany and France. You can get faster to Paris now than by train than with an army. The second question was on optimism and so on. Yeah, it's not. I dropped that word at the end. Putting everything together, I think there are enormous problems in the coming years, especially in the relationship between China and the United States. Whether that will be a relationship that allows for space for autonomy for others, or whether they will begin to go to war with each other. God may prevent us. Then I don't know. But yesterday in a debate, I said, mostly with young people, I was born in 1946, and that was only 1 year after the end of the greatest slaughter in mankind, which is called the Second World War. There's 55 million people dead. Yes? And I'm saying that in order to say that you cannot rule out that such a thing can happen again. These people were exactly as intelligent as we are, and they were human beings in the same way as we are, and they continued to in this slaughter. It is possible that people again may do this, and then our task is to think of where the sources of conflict are, and maybe think about ways to keep this halfway peaceful. Yeah, that's all we can do. Asian small states. Yeah, nationalism. Yes, I think the new politics that we're talking about, there is a place for nationalism in it if nationalism is defensive. And this guy Macron, in one of these one of his speeches on the 100th anniversary of the end of the First World War. He said something that I do not, with a modification I accept. He said, patriotism is the opposite of nationalism. Not to me, but patriotism has something to do with a nation. But I do think that patriotism is not something that, that one should relegate to football, to watching football games. Yeah? It does imply some idea that we have a shared responsibility for a community to which we belong, and not by choice, but by the identity out of which we have grown. And that sort of patriotism can come with a sense that I have to do something for this community. I think without that sense, you cannot build a functioning state. It is impossible. The Scandinavians, so look at the Scandinavians, perfectly democratic, perfectly peaceful people. Yeah? But if you go to Denmark, and as a German, I sort of experienced this very strongly. They are all Danish patriots. What they remember when they see me is how the Germans sort of invaded Denmark. And I need some time to explain to them that I'm not going to invade them. Then we are good friends. But this sense of patriotism that exists in such a small, peaceful, deeply democratic country, yeah, it is not in opposition to democracy. Yeah, I know that's politically not correct to say that. What I call defensive nationalism. There's nationalism that involves I want to conquer my neighbor, and I need a part of Peru because this belongs to us, or of Bolivia. And then there's nationalism in the sense that we want to do something so that we together can survive in a hostile, very uncertain environment. I think why not cultivate this? Yeah? Peter Kassenstein's book, Small States in World Markets, it shows how this spirit of being small, having to defend yourself. I mean, the whole Swedish social democracy, which is a model for leftist politics, arose in the 1930s in the person of Gunnar, what's the name? Myrdal and his wife. Yeah, the two leading figures, economists, the demographers of Swedish social democracy. It was all about how can Sweden, as a small country, survive in a world in which war was on the horizon. Yeah? That was where the deal between Swedish business and Swedish labor was made, which lasted well into the 1980s, from the late 19th Saltsjöbaden Agreement, from the 1930s into the 1980s. It made Sweden a peaceful country and a prosperous country. There's nothing wrong with cooperating in a country, especially a small and democratic one, in order to make that country peaceful.
Last round, whatever you want.
No, that's for you to decide.
La última ronda, en caso que hayan preguntas.
No, I think they have to leave.
¿No? Ok. Le agradezco al profesor Streeck por acompañarnos hoy día y a ustedes por...